I know you already seen the title, but would you believe me if I told you this counter was epoxy? Well, we got that out of the way. It's obviously epoxy, but everything needs to start with a good base, and for the base of this counter, we're going to be using a double laminated sheet of 3/4 inch MDF for a total thickness of 1.5 inches. We're going to glue that up using some Titebond 3, add some screws, you get the gist. Let's roll right through that. One lesson I have learned the hard way is make sure you remove any screws where you might have a faucet going in, because they're gonna be right in the way. Would like to take a moment to thank Total Boat for supplying the epoxy for this countertop and for sponsoring this video. Total Boat tabletop epoxy is what we are using, and this kit that I laid out has everything you need to make a marble epoxy countertop. From the resin, hardener, heat gun, paddles to lay everything out, brushes, color, and everything. Check out those products at TotalBoat.com, link in the description, and thanks to Total Boat for supporting the channel. In preparation for all these different pours that we need to do, I laid out some trash bags to catch all of the drips and taped everything off using Scotch's Sharp Line Blue Tape, the best. We are ready to pour on what is called a seal coat. This is going to be about 1/16 of an inch thick, and I'm going to do it with white pigment because that is going to be the base of this marble color countertop. We already did prime this, and the biggest reason for that was to get some additional color on this already, because past countertops I've had in the past, when I didn't do the base color coat, it made it a little bit more complicated, especially to get the edges covered in that white color that we want. So we're going to go ahead and mix up about 2 quarts of epoxy, add the white pigment, and then we'll pour that on, probably leave it for about a half an hour to 40 minutes, and then we will pull the tape off of the inside and the front here so that we can let that epoxy drain a little bit over the edge. It will be set up a little bit at this point, so it won't just come pouring off of here, because we want to seal all the way around these edges. If you don't add the tape as a barrier like this, all of your epoxy will just flow off of the edges. And you do want to make sure that your countertop is nice and level so that you don't puddle things up on one side or the other. And we are going to go ahead and pour in equal parts hardener and resin till we have about 2 quarts. You do want to make sure when you're doing epoxy that your environment is warm enough. It is about 65 degrees in the shop here, which is probably the minimum you want. And I did have these inside next to the pellet stove, so they were nice and warm and will flow better. And I did add a liter of resin, so I'll need to make sure I go with the metric system instead of imperial here. I would recommend a mixer like I'm showing on the screen right here, but I left that up at the lake, so I made a makeshift one with a paint stick and cut the end off so it'll fit in my drill. This should work okay. Gonna go ahead and pour out the seal coat. One thing to be aware of when you leave epoxy in a bucket like this, it goes exothermic much faster, so it'll get really, really hot. Like a bucket this big, if you were to leave it alone, it would probably start steaming. It would be too hot to touch. So you wanna make sure you get it out on the countertop instead of leaving it in there, because your open time working on the counter will be much longer. Not that you really need it for this, because we're not gonna do any color in this coat, but you do wanna make sure you give it plenty of time for those bubbles to come out. So really mix it up and get it out of the bucket as soon as you can. Just gonna try to pour a nice steady stream through here so that we don't have to paddle things around too much. As you're going along, you'll see little air pockets like this, and it's funny, once you actually kind of just knock those down and get rid of the air bubble, the epoxy will flow through there and even that out on itself. Go ahead and grab your heat gun, and this is going to do a couple of things. This is going to pop the surface bubbles on top of the epoxy, and it will actually heat the epoxy up a little bit and help it flow. You can actually push epoxy around a little bit with the heat gun. You do want to make sure that you don't stay still, or you can burn the surface of that epoxy. We're actually going to use this again later on when we're doing the marbling effect to literally push the epoxy around. It's pretty cool. I think we're getting pretty close to being able to pull the tape off. So you can just check and see what the flow looks like. It can still wait a little bit here. We want it to set up a little bit more than that, just so we don't lose a ton of material over the edges. Alrighty, our first seal coat, color coat is down and it has cured. Because we have let it cure, we now need to scratch this to make sure we have any residue on here gone, and just scratch up that surface so that we promote a good bond between the color coat that's going to go on here. And you'll see just a couple places where we have a drip on that bottom lip. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this guy over, and we'll use a hand plane and sander to get rid of that drip down there so that we don't have an area that is going to try to run off more epoxy right at this point than somewhere else along this rim. And now it is time to mix up yet another bucket of Towable epoxy. Mix this one up, and then I transferred a little bit over to a smaller bin so that we could mix our darker accented metallic pigment in that. And it was just the white pigment base in the bigger bucket. A little bit of this pigment goes a long way, both for the powder and for the amount of epoxy that you actually need. Because as you can see, we only use a very little bit of it for the accents. Go ahead and dump out your base coat. You want to do this one in a little bit thinner globs compared to what we may have done before, so that we don't have to paddle it out so much, because it is a little bit thinner coat than we previously put down for the seal coat. And this is where it gets really cool, and you can make this piece very much your own. I didn't really have any pattern in mind. I did look at a couple of marble patterns online before getting started, but I just wanted to go with something kind of natural. the biggest recommendations I can make is that you run your lines completely off of the workpiece. You can see I'm running from end to end off of the tape so that we don't get any random puddles kind of at the edges. I went back through some areas and actually blotched it out with the supplied paintbrush to give it a wider sunburst kind of feel. And then popping the bubbles with the heat gun, and it's really cool that you can actually go in with the heat gun and actually push the epoxy around to give it different patterns. And if you don't like something, you can push it around with the heat gun, and you can even go back with a brush to completely blotch out lines that you might not like, and then again even it out with the heat gun and it will disappear, never to be seen again. I can smell the epoxy setting up, and looking at the edge here, just like before, when I pull the tape, it pulls over the edge a little bit but doesn't pour over, so I think we are ready to go. Compared to doing past jobs, having a deeper round over definitely helps with getting material to flow over that edge because it's puddled up right in here when you got the tape. Whereas if you have a real small round over, you don't actually have enough material to go over the edge quite as well. Here you can see how the marbling effect is really rolling over the edge. Pretty cool. Lines follow right down, and we'll let that just drip off the edge, and we'll clean up the bottom just like we did before doing this coat. Same thing inside. Pretty sweet. I didn't really want to have to smooth out the front edge, but I had to. The epoxy was setting up a little bit too fast, so I smoothed it out with my finger, being careful not to get the accent lines, and then smoothed it out completely with a heat gun. Well, I believe that the color coat is looking fabulous. Everything seems to have cured up very well. Happy with that. And it is time to drill the holes in here for the faucets. Now you might be wondering, Tyler, why didn't you drill the holes and then put the epoxy on? And the real reason is I didn't have the faucets in, didn't know what size hole to do and whatnot. So we're doing these sweet little farmhouse, kind of look like a pump, faucet majiggers. And I am not going to put the plate on there, so no plate here. It'll just be the faucet sitting on the gasket. So I'm just going to center that in the bowl, and then I'm going to set it back the bare minimum that I need to so that we can get the faucet pouring out into the middle of the sink. Just when you thought you might be done, not so fast there, young Padawan. We are going to scratch coat the top of this countertop, and we're going to add one more clear coat on the top just for that added bit of protection. All the same process. Mix it up, paddle it out, smooth it down, heat it up, bubbles gone, ready to go. And we're making sure to get inside all of the holes for the faucets. All right, we have flipped the counter over. I have not cleaned up the drips that have dripped down from the top because we are now going to pour a clear coat on the bottom. And you probably don't really have to do this, but this is an MDF countertop. I want to make sure it's sealed all the way around so that no water gets in here and damages. So once this clear coat clears on the bottom, we will then clear up these bumps so it's nice and smooth from the top, transitioning over to the bottom. One lesson I can certainly pass on here is it would have been best to do the bottom seal coat in white as well. There are no issues with the clear. The problem is looking at the front lip of the countertop, it actually looks like there are drips of water on there because you have the white and the clear epoxy kind of mixed in these ridges that I hadn't planed down previously. So that's something to consider if you were to do something like this. I actually found that some of these drips were easiest to take off with a bit of side cutters before hitting it with the planer. And then it was time for a whole bunch of sanding. On the bottom, nothing in particular, but on the top I did work my way up from 120 grit up to the highest grit that I had, which was 400. Now you can see a polishing wheel in the top right corner. I didn't actually use that because it seemed to me like that added a slight bit of yellow tint in the marbling, and I didn't really like it. Now there are some micro bubbles in this, and I don't really know what a better solution would have been besides maybe a little bit more work with the heat gun to try to release those bubbles from the countertop, but you really have to look close to be able to see them. We mounted the sinks using the supplied hardware and some silicone in between, and we were ready for installation in the bathroom. You probably saw the vanity build for this countertop a couple of weeks ago, but there is a link in the description below if you missed it.
It's a dishwasher
Nope,
thing.
that's a sink, not a dishwasher. No dishwasher.
Dishwasher down the house.
Yes.
Whose is that thing?
Little fingers. Oh wow, look at that.
I'm so fun at this.
That's so good. There we go. Look at that, huh? You like that?
Yeah. Cool.
Like that?
Yeah, I have.
That work? Clapping over?